Emily, turn off the lights. Do not open that door. Those are Hell's Angels, every last one of them. The voice on the phone was shaking. Outside, 59 motorcycles had gone silent in the snow. And Emily Carter, 32 years old, a single mother with $7 in her register and a sleeping child in the back room, stood at that locked door with her hand on the deadbolt and made the decision that would change her life forever. Before we go any further, if you've ever done something brave when everyone told you not to drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe and stay with us to the very end. This one is going to stay with you. The storm came without much warning, the way the worst things in life usually do. Cedar Hollow, Colorado sat tucked between two mountain ridges at an elevation that turned nasty weather into something genuinely dangerous. And the locals had learned long ago to read the sky the way other people read clocks. When the clouds started stacking up gray and low over the western ridge around 4 in the afternoon, the older residents of town didn't need a weather report. They pulled their cars into their garages, called their kids in from the yards, and started checking whether they had enough firewood stacked against the side of the house. By 6 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 17 degrees. By 7, the snow was coming sideways. Emily Carter had been on her feet since 5 that morning. The Hollow Cup, her roadside cafe on the edge of Route 9, was the kind of place that lived and died by the truck drivers and highway travelers who needed coffee, a hot plate, and a clean restroom before pushing further into the mountains. It wasn't glamorous. The vinyl booths along the window had seen better decades. The coffee maker on the back counter was held together by a replacement part she'd ordered from 3 states away. The pie case near the register still worked, but the seal on the glass door had gone soft, and she had to keep a rolled dish towel at the base to keep the cold air out. But it was hers, or it almost was. Her father, Robert Carter, had built it from nothing in 1987, pouring every dollar he had into the land, the building, the equipment, and the small apartment attached to the back where Emily had grown up doing homework at a table 6 feet from the deep fryer. When Robert died 3 years ago, he left Emily the cafe, the equipment, the debt, and a note tucked inside the deed that read, "This place fed a lot of hungry people. Don't let it stop." Emily had tried. She had done everything a person could reasonably do. She had restructured the payment schedule twice with the bank. She had cut her own salary down to almost nothing. She had sold her car and started driving her father's old truck. She had taken on catering jobs for town events, birthday parties, a retirement dinner for the high school principal. She had applied for a small business grant through the county and been rejected. She had applied again and been waitlisted. And through all of it, she had kept the lights on. But the bank's last letter, the one sitting under the coffee maker where she wouldn't have to look at it while she worked, had made something very clear. She had 41 days. After that, the cafe and the land beneath it would begin foreclosure proceedings. The words were polished and professional and utterly devastating, and Emily had read that letter 6 times each time, hoping she'd misunderstood something, and each time understanding it perfectly. Her daughter Lily was asleep in the back apartment. 7 years old, 2nd grade, currently missing her 2 front teeth, and deeply invested in a library book about penguins she'd checked out 3 weeks ago and refused to return. Lily didn't know about the 41 days. Lily didn't know about the bank. Lily knew that her mom worked long hours and that the cafe smelled like coffee, and that sometimes when things had been a good week, they got to order pizza on Friday nights. Emily intended to keep it that way as long as she possibly could. She was wiping down the counter at 7:40 in the evening, listening to the wind throw itself against the front windows when she heard the sound. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the storm. It was engines, a lot of them. She straightened up and looked through the glass, and what she saw made her set the rag down slowly, the way you set something down when your hands suddenly don't feel steady. Motorcycles, one after another, pulling off Route 9 and into her gravel parking lot, headlights sweeping across the snow-covered ground. The sound building on itself until it was less like individual machines and more like something geological, something that had mass and weight in its own weather system. She counted without meaning to, 10, 20, 30. She stopped counting at 40 and started backing toward the phone on the wall. The first call she received came before she could make one herself. It was Sandra Hewitt from the diner 2 blocks over, and Sandra didn't bother with hello. "Emily, listen to me. Are you watching what's in your parking lot right now?" "I'm watching it." "Turn off the lights right now. Turn them off and lock the door and go to the back with Lily." Sandra: "Those are Hell's Angels patches. I can see them from my upstairs window. Emily, I am not joking with you. My brother-in-law was a county deputy for 22 years, and he told me stories that would make your hair white. You turn those lights off. Emily looked at the windows. The snow was coming harder now, near whiteout in the gusts, and she could see the riders dismounting, stamping their boots against the cold, pulling their jackets tighter. They're freezing out there, she said. Emily. I hear you, Sandra. She hung up. The second call came 90 seconds later. Dale Pritchard, who owned the hardware store and had lived in Cedar Hollow for 63 years and considered himself the unofficial historian of everything that had ever gone wrong in a 40-mile radius. Don't do it, Dale said. Don't do whatever you're thinking about doing. I can see your lights are still on. Turn them off. Those boys are not your problem. There's a blizzard outside. There's a blizzard outside every winter, and we all manage to find shelter without stopping at a woman's cafe alone at night. There are 60 of them, Dale. They didn't exactly slip by unnoticed. Emily, his voice dropped. I knew your father. Robert was a good man, and he would not want you to put yourself and that little girl at risk. Lock up and stay back. She held the phone against her ear and looked out at the parking lot. That was when she saw it. One of the riders had gone down. Not a fall from the motorcycle, the bikes were already parked. This was something else. A man in a leather jacket. A young one, by the way he moved before he stopped moving, had taken 3 steps from his bike and then simply folded. His knees went first, then his shoulders. He went down into the snow and the men around him dropped to him immediately, 2 of them getting their arms under him, a third one pressing his hand to the man's neck. And she could see from the window that nobody was panicking, but everyone was afraid. Dale, she said, I'll call you back. She put the phone on the hook. She stood at the door for 5 seconds that felt considerably longer than 5 seconds. She thought about Sandra's warning. She thought about Dale's voice saying Robert was a good man. She thought about the letter under the coffee maker and the 41 days in Lily's penguin book in the rolled dish towel against the base of the pie case. Then she thought about the man in the snow. She unlocked the door and pushed it open against the wind. The cold hit her like something deliberate. Like the storm had been waiting for exactly this moment to remind her what it was capable of. She stepped out onto the porch and raised her voice over the wind. Bring him inside. The 2 men holding the collapsed rider looked up at her. They didn't move right away. They looked at her the way people look at something unexpected, calculating whether it's real. Now, she said, before he loses any more heat, bring him inside. The bigger of the 2 men, broad-shouldered, silver-haired at the temples with a patch on his chest that read, Reynolds above the chapter insignia, met her eyes for a moment. Then he nodded once to the man beside him, and they lifted the young rider and carried him toward the door. Emily held it open and stepped back into her cafe. The man they carried in was young, mid-20s maybe, dark hair plastered against his forehead from the snow. His skin had gone the kind of pale that was actually gray at the edges, and his lips were carrying the blue tint that Emily recognized from the first aid certification she'd renewed every 2 years since her father made her get it when she turned 19. Lay him here, she said, moving to clear the longest booth, sweeping the napkin holder and the condiment tray to the next table in one motion. On his back. Keep his head level. They set him down. How long was he outside in this, she asked. 2, maybe 3 hours, the silver-haired man said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had learned to stay that way in situations where other voices cracked. The storm hit us on the pass. We couldn't see 20 feet ahead. By the time we got off the mountain, Michael here had been running cold for a long time. We didn't know how bad until he got off the bike. Does he have any medical history I should know about, heart condition, anything like that? Not that I know of. He's 23 years old. He's healthy. He was, Emily said not unkindly, already moving toward the supply closet. Right now he's hypothermic. She came back with 3 blankets, the heavy ones she kept for slow winter nights, when the heat in the cafe took too long to catch up, and began layering them over Michael with the efficiency of someone who had actually thought about what she would do in an emergency because that was who Emily Carter was. You need to get the wet jacket off first, she said. Don't rub his skin. You're going to warm him gradually, not fast. Fast can stop his heart. The silver-haired man, Reynolds, crouched beside the booth and worked the zipper on Michael's jacket with careful hands. Around them, the rest of the riders had begun filtering through the door. slow at first, then steadily filling the cafe until every booth and every stool at the counter was occupied, and men were standing 3 deep along the back wall. Emily did not look up from Michael. She went to the kitchen and came back with a bowl of warm water, not hot warm, and a stack of clean towels. She wrapped Michael's hands first, then his feet, after pulling off his soaked boots. She elevated his legs slightly with a folded tablecloth. She took his pulse and counted under her breath and didn't let her face show the number she got. "Talk to him," she told Reynolds without looking up. "Keep him engaged. Ask him questions he has to answer." Reynolds pulled a stool up beside the booth and leaned down close. "Michael, you hear me. Tell me the name of that bar in Albuquerque you keep talking about. The one with the bad wings." A silence, then barely Santino's. "That's right. Why do you keep going back there if the wings are bad?" "Because the jukebox has Merle Haggard." "That's the worst reason I've ever heard." "You've never heard Merle Haggard." Reynolds almost smiled. "I've heard plenty of Merle Haggard." "Then you know." Emily allowed herself one breath of relief. Coherent sentences. That was good. That was very, very good. She stood up and turned around, and for the first time she really looked at the 60 men who had taken over her cafe. It was nothing like what she had been told to expect. They were quiet. Not the quiet of people holding something back, but the quiet of people who were genuinely exhausted and cold and grateful to be out of the weather. 2 of the older men were already at the condiment station straightening things that had gotten knocked sideways when everyone came in. A man near the window had found the stack of extra napkins under the counter. She kept them there behind the menus and was distributing them to the men around him without being asked. 2 others had moved the pushed-together stools back against the counter, with the automatic consideration of people who understood they were guests in someone else's space. A large man with a gray beard braided at the ends caught her looking and gave her a short nod. Not aggressive, acknowledging. She nodded back. She went to the kitchen and started the coffee, all 6 burners, every pot she had. When the first wave of mugs went out 10 minutes later, carried by Emily and the 2 men who had quietly followed her to the pass-through window and asked without a trace of demand in their voices if they could help, the sound that moved through the cafe was something she hadn't expected. Gratitude. Simple, uncomplicated human gratitude. It sounded the same coming from 60 Hells Angels riders in a frozen mountain town as it did from the truck drivers and retirees and young families who made up her usual crowd. It sounded like thank you. It sounded like God, that's good. It sounded like the specific exhale of people who had been cold for a long time and were finally slowly getting warm. Emily was back at the stove working through her inventory. She had eggs, she had bread, she had 4 pounds of breakfast sausage she'd prepped for the morning rush. That wasn't going to happen in a blizzard anyway when she heard the phone ring again. She wiped her hands and picked it up. Emily Carter. It was a voice she didn't recognize. Male, middle-aged professional. "This is Deputy Tom Kelleher out of the county sheriff's office. We've had reports of a large motorcycle group stopping at your location. I want to check that you're safe and that you're there voluntarily." "I'm safe," she said, "and I'm voluntary." "Ma'am, I want to be clear about what we're looking at here. This group appears to be affiliated with—" "I know who they're affiliated with, Deputy. They're eating scrambled eggs and drinking coffee, and one of them is recovering from hypothermia on my best booth. They have not broken anything, taken anything, or threatened anyone. I'm going to need to get back to the kitchen." A pause on the line. "Are you sure you don't need us to come out there?" "The roads are closed," she said flatly. "That's why they're here." She hung up and went back to the eggs. Michael was sitting upright by the time the food started coming out. Still pale, still moving, carefully but upright, which was the word Emily kept coming back to in her head as she plated and passed. He was upright. He was going to be fine. She had done that. Her father had taught her the basics of cold weather. First aid the winter she turned 12 after a hiking accident on the ridge above town had taken the life of a man who might have survived if someone had known what to do. Robert Carter had believed that knowing what to do was a moral obligation. He had passed that belief to his daughter as completely as he had passed her. His stubbornness and his pie recipes, and his conviction that the road in front of the cafe was there for people to use, and people on the road deserved the chance to stop. She was plating the 3rd round of orders when Reynolds appeared at the kitchen pass-through. "I want to settle the bill," he said. "You can do that when things calm down." "I want to do it now." He set a card on the counter. "Run whatever you need. Don't be shy about it." "Mr. Reynolds." Jack. I'm not going to overcharge you. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to charge me correctly. He met her eyes through the pass-through window. You opened your door when every other door on this road was locked. That has a value. Emily looked at the card. It was a regular debit card, plain blue with a credit union logo from somewhere in Arizona. I'll charge you for the food and the coffee, she said. That's your call. He paused. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. You knew who we were. You heard the bikes, and you still opened the door. He said it simply without drama, like he was identifying a fact that needed to be understood. Why? Emily was quiet for a moment. She thought about the $7 in the register. She thought about the letter. She thought about Lily in the back room. She thought about the way Michael's lips had gone blue and the math she had done on instinct that a man who was that cold in that storm had maybe 20 minutes before the situation became something that couldn't be undone. Because someone needed help, she said. Jack Reynolds studied her for a long moment. That's the whole reason. That's the whole reason. He nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he had suspected but needed to hear out loud. Okay, he said, and he went back to his people. The storm howled against the windows all night. The cafe was warm and loud and full of the sound of men who had been cold and frightened and were now safe telling each other the kind of stories that come out when the worst of something is behind you. Emily heard laughter she hadn't expected. She heard arguments about sports teams and highway routes and the comparative quality of gas station burritos in 4 different states. She heard a man in the corner booth call his wife and tell her he was okay, and she could go to sleep, and Emily heard the particular quality of silence that descended over the men near him when he did. These were not the men Sandra Hewitt had warned her about. Or maybe they were, and Sandra Hewitt was wrong. Somewhere around midnight, Emily made herself a cup of coffee and sat on the stool at the far end of the counter and let herself stop moving for the first time in 19 hours. Her feet ached. Her lower back had opinions. The cooking, the serving, the restocking, the quiet triage of keeping 60 people fed, and 1 young man alive had burned through every reserve she had, and what was left was the strange, hollow lightness that comes after you have given everything you had to give. She was sitting there too tired to decide if she was happy or sad or mad or just present when she became aware of Michael standing beside her. He was moving carefully, one hand on the counter for balance, but he was standing. He had someone's flannel shirt over his own now, and his color had come back to the point where he looked less like a medical situation and more like a very tired 23-year-old. I wanted to say thank you, he said, properly, while I still could. Emily looked up at him. You were never not going to make it. You don't know that. No, she admitted. I don't. He was quiet for a second. I've been riding for 6 years. Never had anything like that happen. The cold it got inside me somewhere on that pass, and I couldn't get warm again, no matter what I did. By the time we got down off the mountain, I couldn't tell you my own name for about 30 seconds, and that scared me more than the cold did. That's the hypothermia. Your brain gets slow before your body does. Does that happen to you a lot, knowing that kind of stuff? My dad was big on practical knowledge. He used to say that information was the only thing that couldn't be taken away from you. She looked at her coffee cup. He was right about most things. He sounds like a good man. He was. She said it the way you say the truest things simply and without decoration. Michael looked around the cafe, at the men who had been strangers to this room 4 hours ago now, so settled into it that they looked like they'd been there for years. At the counter that was still clean because people had wiped up after themselves without being asked. At the coffee cups that were being refilled because 2 men near the kitchen had taken it upon themselves to manage the carafe rotation with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that somebody had to. I've been with this chapter for 3 years, Michael said. People see the patch and they think they know what it means. They've already made up their minds before we say a word. He paused. Tonight you made up your mind after. Emily considered that. I didn't make up my mind about anything, she said. I saw someone fall, that's all. That's enough, he said. That's more than most people do. He went back to his booth. Emily sat with her coffee and listened to the storm and thought about her father who had built this place with the idea that the road in front of it was there for people and people deserved the chance to stop. He would have opened the door. She knew that with the same certainty. She knew the pie recipes and the coffee ratio in the particular sound the old furnace made when it was about to quit. He would have opened the door and she was glad in a way that went deeper than words, in a way that felt more like recognition than emotion that she had too. At 4:30 in the morning, the storm began to ease. By 5:15, the roads, according to the county radio broadcast playing low behind the counter, had been downgraded from impassable to treacherous, which in mountain terms meant you could drive on them if you had to, as long as you understood what you were accepting. Men started moving quietly, checking phones, pulling on jackets, the kind of slow, organized stirring that happens in a group when the moment has shifted from staying to going without anyone announcing it. Emily was behind the counter with the register when Reynolds came up to pay. She ran the card for the food and the coffee and a fair amount for the use of the space through the night. He looked at the total and said nothing and signed the receipt. Then he stood there for a moment longer than a man just completing a transaction would stand. "You're about to lose this place," he said. It wasn't a question. Emily looked at him steadily. "What makes you say that?" "Because of how you're looking at it," he said. "I've seen that look before, on people who are trying to memorize something before it's gone." She didn't answer right away. 41 days, she said finally. He absorbed that. His jaw moved slightly, but his expression didn't change. "How much?" "That's not. How much?" "More than I have," she said. "Less than it would cost to start over somewhere else. But it doesn't matter. The bank's made their decision, and I've run out of things to try." Reynolds looked at the space around him, at the old pie case with the dish towel at the base, at the photographs her father had hung along the far wall, black and whites of the highway in different decades of the cafe, in its first year of Robert Carter himself, standing behind the same counter in 1987, with a look on his face like he couldn't believe he'd actually done it. "I want you to know something," Reynolds said quietly. "What you did tonight, it's going to travel. That's not a promise. That's just how things work when someone does something real." Emily looked at him. "I made eggs and coffee, Jack. I kept someone warm." "No," he said. "You opened a door that every other person on this road kept shut, in a blizzard, for 60 strangers. That's not eggs and coffee." He held her gaze. "People don't forget that, my people especially." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said the thing that was true. "I hope he stays warm," she said, nodding toward Michael's booth. "Your boy, I hope he gets home safe." Reynolds picked up the signed receipt. "People who open doors when everyone else tells them to close them," he said, "are never forgotten." He put on his jacket. He walked out into the cold gray light of an almost morning in Colorado. And Emily Carter stood at her counter in her father's cafe and listened to 60 motorcycles start up in the snow one after another until the sound of them faded into the mountain air and left behind nothing but the wind and the quiet and the smell of coffee and the particular unnameable feeling of having done the right thing when it was hard. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know that the story of what she'd done that night was already moving past from rider to rider in the way that things travel through a community that communicates without announcements and remembers without being reminded. She didn't know that Jack Reynolds, sitting on his motorcycle at the edge of Route 9 before he turned south, had already made a phone call. She just knew that the cafe was warm, and that the man in her best booth had said his own name clearly before he left, and that her father somewhere was not surprised. She picked up the dish towel from the base of the pie case. She put it in the laundry. She started a fresh pot of coffee, and she kept the lights on. The morning after the storm, Cedar Hollow woke up and immediately started talking. That was the thing about small towns. They didn't need newspapers. They had Sandra Hewitt calling Dale Pritchard at 7 in the morning, and Dale calling his cousin who worked at the county clerk's office, and the county clerk's cousin stopping by the barbershop. And by 9 o'clock, there wasn't a person within 6 miles of Route 9 who hadn't heard some version of what had happened at the Hollow Cup the night before. Most of the versions were wrong. Emily heard 3 of them before she'd finished her second cup of coffee. The first came from Sandra herself, who arrived at the cafe at 8:15 with a casserole dish covered in foil and an expression that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be concerned or accusatory. "I heard there was damage," Sandra said, setting the casserole on the counter and looking around the room like she was conducting a forensic examination. "There's no damage," Emily said. "Dale said he heard breaking glass." "Dale heard wind against the windows. There was a blizzard, Sandra." Sandra picked up a salt shaker, examined it, set it down. "I also heard one of them pulled a knife." Emily stared at her. Absolutely nobody pulled a knife. They ate scrambled eggs and paid their bill and left at 5 in the morning. Well, Sandra straightened her coat. You were lucky. I wasn't lucky. I just opened the door. Sandra looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has made up her mind and found the conversation inconvenient. All I'm saying is that it could have gone very differently, Emily. You have a child in this building. I know I have a child in this building. And your father, yeah, but though, my father would have done exactly what I did. Emily's voice was level. He would have done it faster. He would have had the coffee going before they finished parking. Sandra opened her mouth and closed it. She looked at the casserole she'd brought. It's green bean, she said, meaning the casserole. Lily like his green bean. Lily does like green bean, Emily agreed. Thank you, Sandra. After Sandra left, the phone rang 4 times in the next hour. 2 were more versions of the same conversation. One was a reporter from the regional paper in Glenwood Springs who had gotten a tip from someone in the county sheriff's office and wanted to ask Emily about harboring a criminal organization during a natural disaster, which was not a phrase Emily felt was accurate or fair, and she said so with considerable clarity before hanging up. The 4th call was from the bank, which had nothing to do with the previous night and everything to do with the letter that was still sitting under the coffee maker, and she let that one go to the machine. Lily came out of the apartment at 9, sleep soft and carrying the Penguin book, and climbed onto the counter stool she had claimed as hers since she was old enough to climb, and asked for toast with the good butter, which was the salted kind. And did Emily know that emperor penguins could hold their breath for 20 minutes? I did not know that, Emily said. It's because their blood does something special when they dive. The book explains it, but I didn't understand that part yet. You'll get there. Mom, Lily looked up from the book with the direct, undecorated attention of a 7-year-old who has decided something is important. Were those motorcycle people nice? Emily put the toast down in front of her. What do you know about motorcycle people? I woke up a little bit. I heard the engines. Lily spread butter with excessive care. And then I heard you talking, and I looked through the crack in the door, and there were a lot of them. Emily sat down on the stool beside her own. Why didn't you come out? Because you didn't sound scared. Lily took a bite of toast. When you're scared, your voice gets a little bit higher. Yours didn't, so I went back to bed. Emily looked at her daughter for a long moment. At the gap where the 2 front teeth were growing back in still small, still new, at the Penguin book held open on the counter with one careful thumb. They were nice, she said. Most of them were very nice. Lily nodded like this confirmed something she'd already decided. The one who was sick, she said. He got better? He got better? Good. She turned a page. Did you know that penguins mate for life? I think I'd heard that. I think that's a good way to do it, Lily said seriously, and she went back to her book. The cafe opened at 10:10, which was later than usual but reasonable given that Emily had slept 3 hours and the roads were still bad enough that most people wouldn't be driving unless they had to. She had 5 customers before noon, 2 regulars, a road crew worker who was helping with the highway clearing, and 2 women from the church auxiliary who came in together, ordered pie, and spent 45 minutes asking Emily questions she answered with the same 3 words in different arrangements. They were fine. What she didn't tell the church auxiliary women or Sandra or Dale Pritchard when he stopped by after lunch was what was actually sitting in her head. It wasn't fear. She was done being afraid. She'd been afraid enough for one lifetime. In those 5 seconds at the locked door, and on the other side of it had been something that surprised her more than the cold or the noise or the sheer volume of leather and iron in her small cafe. It was the way Reynolds had looked at her when she said because someone needed help and nothing else. Like he had asked a question, expecting a complicated answer, and gotten a simple one, and the simplicity of it had thrown him. She kept turning that over. She was still turning it over 3 days later when Michael Dawson walked back into the hollow cup alone. She recognized him before he was fully through the door. The dark hair, the jacket, the careful way he was still moving, the slight self-consciousness of a young man returning somewhere he'd been vulnerable. He was carrying something. A box, brown cardboard, not large, but obviously heavy for its size, held with both hands. I was in the area, he said, which they both knew was not true because Cedar Hollow was not on the way to anywhere. I wanted to bring you something. He set the box on the counter. Emily looked at it. Michael, you didn't have to. It's from the chapter, he said, not from me personally. Well, some of it's from me personally, but Jack put it together. She opened the box. Inside was an envelope sealed with her name on it in handwriting that was economical and deliberate. Beneath the envelope was a folded piece of paper, and beneath that, wrapped in a clean cloth, were two things she didn't immediately understand. A small electric heating element from a commercial coffee maker and a door seal, strip that exactly matched the dimensions of her failing pie case. She looked up at him. How did he know about the pie case? Michael almost smiled. Jack notices things. It's actually a little unsettling once you're used to it. She looked at the envelope. He said to read it when you had a minute alone, Michael said. He also said, he stopped, reconsidered. He said you'd probably say you didn't need it, and that if you did say that, I should tell you that need isn't the point. Emily set the envelope down on the counter beside the box. How are you feeling? She asked. Normal, he said. Better than normal. A little embarrassed. Don't be. I went down in a parking lot in front of 58 people I ride with, he said. There's some embarrassment involved, whether I want it there or not. You were hypothermic. I know what I was. That doesn't make the 58 people disappear. But he said it without real edge, more like a man making an accurate report on his own situation. Can I get coffee? Sit down, she said. He sat at the counter. She poured 2 cups without deciding to and sat across from him on the other stool. And for a few minutes, they just drank coffee and didn't say anything, which was the kind of comfortable silence that was either the mark of 2 people who were very different from each other or very alike. Tell me something, Emily said finally. Okay. What does it actually mean, the patch, the chapter, the whole? She gestured, which was as close as she got to describing something she didn't have words for. What does it actually mean to the people who have it? Michael turned his coffee cup in his hands. He took a moment with the question, which she respected. It means you belong somewhere, he said. That's the simple version. He looked up. The complicated version is, you know how some people have families that are just there. They didn't choose them. They didn't earn them. They were just born into them. And those people are obligated to show up. This isn't that. Every single person in that chapter chose to be there, and everybody else in it chose to let them in. So when someone shows up for you, it's not because they're supposed to. It's because they actually want to. Emily was quiet. My family wasn't. He paused. I grew up in a house where showing up was optional. My dad treated it as optional pretty regularly. So when I found a group of people who treated it as mandatory, who treated you as mandatory, he looked for the word. It filled in something. Emily thought about her own daughter's voice from 2 nights ago. You didn't sound scared. So I went back to bed, a child who trusted her mother's steadiness so completely that she went back to sleep in the middle of a blizzard with 60 strangers in the next room. She thought she understood something about filling in something. Jack was like that, she asked. For you? Jack is like that for everyone, Michael said. That's why he leads. Not because he's the loudest or the most intimidating. Because he decides who matters and then he doesn't waver on it. He drank his coffee. 3 years ago, I came to a chapter meeting with nothing. No job, no place to sleep, about $40 to my name, and a bike that was running on spite. Jack spent 2 hours after that meeting helping me go through what I needed. Didn't offer charity, offered work. I helped repair 3 bikes that week and slept on his couch and ate his wife's cooking. And by the end of the month, I had a job with a mechanic who was a chapter contact and an apartment deposit. He shook his head slightly. He never mentioned it again after that, like it was already over. Emily looked at the sealed envelope on the counter. What do you think is in it? She asked. I think it's information, Michael said carefully, about how things might work, but you should read it for yourself. She picked it up. She turned it over in her hands. She set it down again. Later, she said, you want another cup? Yeah, he said, I really do. She refilled both cups, and they sat in the quiet of a Wednesday afternoon in a cafe that was mostly empty, and outside the last of the storm's residue was slowly giving up its grip on the road. And Lily was at school learning things, and the letter from the bank was still under the coffee maker, and none of that had changed. But something had shifted, something small and structural like a bone setting. Michael left an hour later, and Emily watched his bike pull out onto Route 9 and head south, and then she went to the counter, and she picked up the envelope and she opened it. Jack Reynolds did not write the way he talked. He wrote the way someone writes when they've chosen every word with the deliberateness of a man who doesn't waste things. The letter was 2 pages handwritten, and she read it standing at the counter because she hadn't thought to sit down. He wrote that he had been writing for 31 years, that he had stopped in towns from the Oregon coast to the Florida panhandle and every variation of American geography in between. That in 31 years of stopping in towns, he had learned that you could predict almost everything about a place by watching what his people did when something unexpected arrived at their edge. He wrote that he had sat in her booth at midnight and watched her move through that cafe, refilling, reassuring, managing 60 people in one medical situation without a single moment of performance, without ever once making them feel like a burden she was managing rather than people she was caring for, and that he had understood something he didn't often come to understand about another person so quickly. He wrote that he had made a phone call before he left the parking lot at 5 in the morning. He did not say who he'd called. He wrote that Emily would likely hear from some people in the coming days, that she should not feel obligated to anything, that the help, if it came without strings and without expectations, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was not operating with his knowledge or his blessing. He wrote that what she had done for his chapter, and specifically for Michael Dawson, was not the kind of thing that men like his forgot, and that men like his had a code about that. And the code was simple. You took care of the people who took care of you. He wrote at the bottom of the second page in handwriting that was slightly different from the rest, like he'd stopped and come back to it. The sign above your door says the hollow cup. It should say open, because that's what you are, and that's harder to find than you think. Emily stood at the counter for a long time after she finished reading. Then she folded the letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, closed the way she kept things she didn't want to lose. She was still standing there when the door opened. She expected a customer. She expected Sandra again, or Dale, or possibly the reporter from Glenwood Springs trying a second angle. She did not expect the woman who walked in. 50, maybe 55. Short silver hair cut practical and close. A canvas jacket with what looked like motor oil on the left cuff that she clearly hadn't noticed or didn't care about. She was carrying a clipboard, and she moved through the door the way people move when they own whatever room they walk into, not aggressively, just as a matter of fact. She looked at Emily. Emily Carter. That's me. I'm Diane Walsh. She didn't offer a chapter affiliation or a title or any other context. Jack Reynolds is my brother-in-law. Emily waited. He called me 4 days ago, Diane said, before the sun was up. I have not received a call from Jack Reynolds before the sun was up in 11 years, so I took it seriously. She set the clipboard on the counter. I'm a contractor, licensed and insured in this state and 4 others. I work mostly commercial renovation. Jack gave me a rough description of the building's issues, and I drove up this morning to take a look. Emily looked at the clipboard. There were measurements on it, notes, numbers and columns. You already looked at the building. I walked around the outside, checked the foundation, the roof line, the utility connections. I'll need to go through the interior properly if we're going to talk specifics. Diane looked at her directly. But I'll tell you what I see from the outside first if you want the truth without a filter. Yes, Emily said, because that was the only answer she knew how to give. The roof has 2 sections that need immediate attention, or you'll have interior damage by spring. The east wall has a crack in the foundation that's been developing for at least 2 winters based on the staining. Your utility connections are old enough that I'd want a licensed electrician to go through them before I'd be comfortable about anything else. The structural bones of the building are sound. The bones are actually excellent. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. My father built it, Emily said. Diane's expression didn't change, but something in it acknowledged that. He knew what he was doing, she said again, quieter. Emily pressed her hands flat on the counter. I appreciate this. I genuinely do. But I have to be honest with you, Ms. Walsh. I can't pay for what you're describing. I can't pay for a fraction of what you're describing. I'm 41 days from losing this building, and I have done the math more times than I can count, and it doesn't come out differently no matter how I run it. Diane picked up her clipboard. Did you read Jack's letter? I read it. Then you know this isn't a quote. She held Emily's gaze. I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm here because my brother-in-law called me before sunrise and told me that a woman in Cedar Hollow opened her door to his chapter in a blizzard, kept a 23-year-old kid from dying of hypothermia, fed 60 men through the night, and charged them fairly for it. And when I asked him what he wanted me to do about it, he said, she paused. He said, Diane, I want you to go fix her door. The silence that followed was very complete. Emily felt something happen in her chest that she couldn't have named under any circumstances. It wasn't relief exactly. Relief was smaller than this. It was more like the feeling of carrying something so long, you stopped noticing the weight, and then someone simply took it from you without asking, and your body didn't know how to recalibrate. I can't let you do this for free, she said. Her voice was steady because she made it steady. It's not free, Diane said. Jack's chapter has already covered materials. I'm donating labor because I want to, and because I can, and because the last time I was in a situation where someone opened a door for me when they didn't have to, it changed my life, and I have been waiting 18 years to pay that forward to the right person. She said it without drama, matter of fact, like she was citing a specific line item in the clipboard. So technically it's a trade. Your act for mine. Emily looked at her. Also, Diane added almost as an afterthought, I have a guy for the bank situation, former financial advisor, chapter associate. He's very good and he's very motivated. And the word I'd use for what he does to debt restructuring agreements is creative, in the legal sense. Thoroughly legal. She tilted her head slightly. Can I look at the inside of the building now? Emily Carter stood in her father's cafe on a Thursday afternoon in January 41 days from losing everything Robert Carter had built. And she thought about the locked door in the 5 seconds and the man in the snow. She thought about what Reynolds had said before he rode out. People who open doors when everyone else tells them to close them are never forgotten. She hadn't believed him exactly. It had sounded like something a person said, a gracious parting line, the kind of thing that meant a great deal in the moment and dissolved like sugar in water afterward. She believed him now. Yeah, she said to Diane Walsh, come on back. Diane moved into the interior of the cafe with her clipboard and her motor oil cuff and her professional thoroughness, and Emily followed her, and outside on Route 9, the last of the storm's ice was breaking up in the thin winter sunlight, and 150 miles south, Jack Reynolds was sitting in a diner he liked in Pueblo, with his phone on the table and a cup of coffee that wasn't as good as the coffee at the Hollow Cup, and he was waiting for a call he knew was coming. When it came, it wasn't from Emily. It was from a chapter president in New Mexico named Torres. I heard the story, Torres said. Word travels, Reynolds said. Is it true? Every word. A pause. The bank situation. That's real. That's real. Another pause longer. Jack, you know what happens when word like this gets out to enough chapters. I'm counting on it, Reynolds said. That's a lot of people descending on a small town. It's a town that deserves it. Torres was quiet for a moment. Then I'll make some calls. Reynolds drank his coffee. He thought about a woman standing at a locked door in a blizzard with 60 motorcycles in her parking lot and everyone she trusted telling her to turn out the lights. He thought about the way she'd said because someone needed help, like it was the most obvious sentence in the English language, like there was simply no other answer a person could give. He put down his coffee cup. Make as many as you need to, he said. And 4 states away in a small cafe at the edge of a mountain town, Emily Carter showed a contractor through her father's building, and the contractor wrote notes on her clipboard. And in the back room, Lily's penguin book sat open on the kitchen table. And outside the road was clearing, and somewhere in the cold winter air above Cedar Hollow, something was already moving toward them. Something that started with one door. Something that was not finished yet. Diane Walsh worked fast. That was the first thing Emily learned about her. She didn't linger. She didn't deliberate out loud. She didn't ask questions she already knew the answers to. She moved through the Hollow Cup with her clipboard the way a doctor moves through a patient chart, taking in everything, weighing it, making decisions that she'd commit to fully or revise without ego. By the time she'd finished her interior walkthrough that first Thursday afternoon, she had a prioritized list, a materials estimate, and a timeline that she handed to Emily with the same matter-of-fact energy she'd brought through the door. 2 weeks, Diane said, maybe 10 days if the weather holds and I can get my guys up here by Monday. Emily looked at the timeline. Your guys? I have a crew of 6. 4 of them are chapter associates. They work with me on most jobs. 2 are my full-time employees who have been with me long enough that they'd follow me into a burning building and have twice. She tapped the paper. They'll need somewhere to sleep. I saw the motel on Route 9. It's clean, Emily said. The owner is a decent man. Good. Diane looked around the dining room one more time. I want to start on the roof first. Everything else is secondary until the roof is right. After that, foundation east wall, then electrical, then interior work, in whatever order makes sense once I see what's under the surface. She met Emily's eyes. There's always something under the surface. I want you prepared for that. I've been prepared for surprises for about 3 years now, Emily said. I'm good at it. Diane almost smiled. It was a small expression, economical like everything else about her. I can see that. She left at 4 o'clock, and Emily stood in the empty cafe for a moment, doing the thing she'd been doing constantly since that night, running the sequence of events in her head, like a film she kept rewinding to find the frame she'd missed. 60 bikers in a parking lot, a man in the snow, 5 seconds at a locked door. And now a contractor was coming Monday morning, and a financial advisor was supposedly going to call about the bank situation, and somewhere in the machinery of this, she still couldn't fully find the operating logic, the cause and effect that made the world this generous. Her phone rang at 6:30 that evening. Number she didn't recognize, area code from somewhere south. Is this Emily Carter? Male voice, precise and unhurried. It is. My name is Victor Reyes. I'm a financial consultant based in Santa Fe. Jack Reynolds asked me to call you. Emily sat down. I've been in touch with Mountain West Bank, Victor said, specifically with the officer managing your account. I want to be upfront with you. I don't have a resolution yet, but I have an opening. The bank's position is not as fixed as they've presented it. There are federal guidelines around small business foreclosure timing that they are currently not in full compliance with on your account, and that gives us leverage. Emily was very still. What kind of leverage? The kind that gets us a meeting, Victor said. And in my experience, a meeting is everything. Once we're in the room, the conversation changes. He paused. I've handled debt restructuring for small businesses for 18 years. I've worked with banks who were certain they were going to foreclose and left the table with a modified agreement. I am not promising you that outcome. I am telling you that your situation is not what the bank's letter made it appear. They were very clear in that letter. Banks are always very clear in their letters. That's what letters are for. What they're less clear about is what they'll accept when someone who understands their obligations sits across the table from them. Another pause. Miss Carter, will you let me try? Emily thought about 41 days. She thought about the way that number had been sitting in her chest like a stone, getting heavier with every morning she woke up. She thought about Lily asking for toast with the good butter like they had all the time in the world. Yes, she said, I'll let you try. I'll have something to report within the week, Victor said. In the meantime, do not respond to any further communication from the bank without running it by me first. My number is in your phone now. Use it. He hung up. Emily set the phone on the counter and looked at it for a long time. Then she went to the back room and she checked on Lily, who was asleep with the Penguin book open across her chest, and she stood in the doorway watching her daughter breathe in the specific way of children who sleep without reservation, completely, without any part of themselves kept back from it, and she thought about what it meant to do something because someone needed help, and what that simple decision had begun to set in motion, and how she still couldn't entirely make herself believe it was real. She believed it Monday morning. Diane's crew arrived at 7:15 in 2 trucks in a van, which were more vehicles than usually occupied the Hollow Cup parking lot on a January Monday, and they hit the ground working. No warm-up period, no orientation, no standing around looking at things deciding where to begin. They began. Emily watched from the kitchen window while she got the coffee going, and the efficiency of it was almost startling. 6 men who clearly had done this kind of work together long enough that they communicated in half sentences and hand signals and didn't waste time being uncertain. By 9 o'clock, they'd gotten up on the roof. By noon, they'd identified 3 separate problem areas, instead of the 2 Diane had estimated from the ground, and Diane had revised the materials list without a visible change in her expression, made 2 phone calls, and had the additional supplies arriving by 3. She ate lunch at the counter. All 6 of her crew ate at the counter in shifts because the work didn't stop while people ate. They were polite to the point of formality, quick with please and thank you, and they tipped Emily on every meal even though she told Diane food was included and Diane had told them and they'd nodded and tipped anyway. The regular customers, the ones who'd been coming to the Hollow Cup for years, who had opinions about every change and development in Cedar Hollow, and weren't shy about those opinions, watched the crew with the narrow-eyed wariness of people who had heard the rumors and built them into something solid in their heads. Two of them asked Emily quietly and with varying degrees of tact who was paying for this. Friends, she said. What kind of friends? The kind who show up, she said, and she moved on. It was on the third day that Cedar Hollow's reaction shifted. It started with Gary Malone, who owned the hardware store after Dale Pritchard retired, and who had come by to see what kind of supplies the crew was working with in case he could move some inventory. Gary spent 40 minutes talking to Diane's lead carpenter, a man named Sal, who was 53 years old and had been working construction since he was 19 and had the hands to prove it. Sal, it turned out, had grown up 40 miles from where Gary grew up, which in the way of small world construction they established within 10 minutes of talking, and by the end of Gary's visit, he'd offered to source 3 specific materials locally at cost rather than having them driven up from Denver. The next day, Patricia Owens from the church auxiliary came by with sandwiches for the crew because her husband had mentioned the construction work, and Patricia's response to any kind of human effort she could observe was to feed the people doing it. She stood on the porch talking to Diane for half an hour. Emily watched through the window. Whatever they talked about, Patricia left with a different expression than the one she'd arrived with. Less cautious, more settled. The town was deciding something. Emily could feel it the way you feel a weather change before the instrument confirms it, a shift in the quality of the air, in the way conversations paused a half beat differently. She was thinking about this on Thursday afternoon, 4 days into the construction, when the door opened and Dale Pritchard walked in, which surprised her, because Dale Pritchard had been avoiding the Hollow Cup since the morning after the storm, and she knew from his absence that he was in one of his positions. Dale had positions the way other people had, furniture he arranged himself around them, and you navigated accordingly. He sat at the counter, he ordered coffee, he looked at his hands around the cup. I was wrong, he said. Emily refilled her own cup and set it down. About what specifically, she said. Not to be difficult, but because Dale said many things and she wanted to know which one he was acknowledging. About telling you to turn off the lights, he looked up. I've been thinking about it all week. About what would have happened if you'd listened to me. If you'd listened to Sandra. He shook his head. That boy, Michael, he would have survived, Emily said. His people would have found another way. Maybe. Dale looked at her. Maybe not. And that would have been on me as much as anyone. Emily was quiet. I knew your father for 32 years, Dale said. And I sat here and told his daughter to act in a way Robert Carter never would have acted in his own cafe. He picked up his cup. That's been sitting with me. Okay, she said, that's all you're going to give me? What do you want me to give you, Dale? He made a sound that was almost a laugh. I don't know. Absolution, maybe. Go talk to Pastor Williams about absolution. I'm a cafe owner. Robert would have said the same thing, Dale said. And this time the sound was definitely a laugh, small but real. He drank his coffee, set the cup down. What can I do for the repairs? What does your contractor need? Emily looked at him. Talk to Diane, she said. She's outside. And Dale, if you have time this weekend, Sal could use someone who knows where to find things locally. He's been driving to the depot in Glenwood. I know where everything is, Dale said, straightening slightly in the way of a man who has been offered a useful function. I know you do, Emily said. That's why I'm telling you. He was out the door in 3 minutes. That was Thursday. Friday changed everything. Emily was in the kitchen at 7:15 in the morning before Diane's crew had arrived, before Lily had come out of the apartment before the first customer of the day. She had her coffee in the quiet of an early winter morning, and she was doing the thing she did when no one was watching, which was standing at the back window, looking out at the road and the mountains behind it, and letting herself be still. She heard the engine, not engines plural. One engine approaching from the south on Route 9, which was not unusual. Trucks used this road all morning, but then she heard 2, and then she lost count. She put down her coffee and walked through the cafe to the front windows and looked out. The highway was filling, not like it had the night of the storm with the sudden materializing of an unexpected group in bad weather. This was different. This was organized. This was a procession riders coming in from the south in formation 2 by 2, steady and deliberate with the purposeful quality of people who had ridden a long way and knew exactly where they were going. She counted to 30 before she stopped counting, then 50. Then she gave up counting and just watched. Motorcycles from a dozen different chapters visible in the variations of their patches pulling into the parking lot and the overflow gravel beside it, and eventually onto the shoulder of Route 9 itself because there was simply not enough parking for what was arriving. These were not all Reynolds' chapter. She could see that immediately. Different states, different insignia united by the specific energy of people who had come with intention. Her phone rang. Reynolds. "You should probably come outside," he said. "How many?" she asked. 117 last count. More coming from the north. Emily gripped the phone. "Jack." "I told you," he said simply. "People don't forget. She stopped. There were no words that were accurate. "This is not eggs and coffee." "No," he agreed, "it's not." She walked to the door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch, and the cold hit her, and the sound hit her, and the sight of it hit her all at once. And she stood there in the January morning with her breath making clouds in the air and over 100 motorcycles in her parking lot, and the face she was holding was the most difficult thing she'd done since the night of the storm. Reynolds appeared at the edge of the porch. He'd ridden in with the others apparently, and she hadn't seen him among them. "I made some calls," he said. "Torres made some calls. Torres's people made some calls." He looked out at the crowd that was continuing to organize itself in the parking lot with the quiet efficiency of people who knew how to exist in large groups without being directed. "Word about what you did traveled faster than I expected." "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That a woman in Colorado opened her door in a blizzard when every other door was shut. That she kept a young man alive. That she did it because someone needed help, and that was the entire reason. And that she was about to lose everything because her husband left her with debt and the bank had no interest in mercy." He paused. "I told them that she had a 7-year-old daughter and her father had built the place, and she'd been fighting to keep it alone for 3 years. Emily was not going to cry. She decided that cleanly and without drama. "You should have asked me first," she said. "You would have said no." "Yes, I would have. That's why I didn't ask." He looked at her sideways. "I'm sorry for that part. I'm not sorry for the rest." She looked at the crowd, at the faces turning toward her with the particular attentiveness of people who had been told a story and were now meeting the person at the center of it. "What are they here to do?" she asked, though she could already see the answer taking shape. Trucks she hadn't noticed before parked beyond the motorcycles with lumber visible in one bed, electrical equipment in another. "Finish the job," Reynolds said. "Diane put a list out 3 days ago. Every chapter that was sending people was assigned a task. Nobody's here to stand around looking useful." As if on cue, Diane Walsh materialized from somewhere in the organized chaos below the porch, clipboard in hand, already directing traffic with the focused authority of a woman who had been preparing for exactly this expansion of the project and was not remotely overwhelmed by it. "Your contractor," Reynolds observed. "My contractor," Emily agreed. Diane looked up and caught Emily's eyes and gave one decisive nod that meant, "I've got this," and went back to her clipboard. The next 6 hours operated on a scale that Emily had no previous reference point for. Diane's crew, now expanded by something like 40 additional workers with their own tools and materials, moved through the renovation with the organized intensity of people who had built things their whole lives and understood how work happened when people stopped performing effort and started actually doing it. The roof crew expanded. An electrical team went in through the service entrance with equipment that was markedly more sophisticated than what Emily had expected. 2 men who turned out to be plumbers identified a corroded pipe connection that Diane hadn't reached yet and addressed it before it became a crisis. Dale Pritchard arrived at 9 with 3 men from the hardware store and integrated himself into the materials logistics so seamlessly that by afternoon it looked like he'd been part of the plan from the beginning. Pastor Williams came by at 11. He stood at the edge of the parking lot for a long time watching. Then he went back to the church and returned 20 minutes later with 6 members of the congregation who had been apparently waiting to be asked. Sandra Hewitt arrived at noon with the casserole from the other day. She'd frozen it in anticipation of the right moment, which Emily found oddly moving. And within an hour, Sandra was coordinating a food rotation with 3 other women from the neighborhood, keeping the crew fed with the focused generosity of women who understood that work runs on more than materials. By afternoon, the parking lot of the Hollow Cup had become something Cedar Hollow had never seen, and wouldn't forget, a population the size of a small event working on a single building with the unified attention of people who believed in the reason they were there. Lily got home from school at 3:15. Emily was on the porch when the school bus stopped at the end of the road, and her daughter came down the sidewalk in her red coat with her backpack bouncing and Lily stopped at the edge of the parking lot and went very still, taking in the full scope of what was in front of her. Emily came down the porch steps. "Mom," Lily said, "there are so many people." "There are a lot of people," Emily agreed. "Are they fixing the cafe?" "Yes." Lily looked at the activity around them with the quiet, serious attention of a 7-year-old processing something large. She found Michael in the crowd. She recognized him from the night of the storm, apparently even from a distance, and pointed. "That's the one who was sick," she said. "That's Michael. He looks better. He's doing very well." Lily considered this. "Then is it because you opened the door?" Emily looked at her daughter, at the gap in her teeth, in the red coat and the backpack that was always too heavy because she refused to take any books out of it, regardless of whether she needed them that day. "Yeah, baby," she said. "I think that's why." Lily nodded slowly, filing this information somewhere specific. "Good," she said. "I'm glad you opened the door." She went inside to change out of her school clothes, matter of fact, the way children absorb extraordinary things when they trust the adults around them to have made sense of it first. Emily stood on the porch. The afternoon light was going gold and thin, the way it did in January at altitude, and the parking lot below her was full of sound and work and people who had come because of a story that started with her hand on a deadbolt in a blizzard. Reynolds came to stand beside her again. He'd been working alongside his own crew most of the day, not directing working, which she'd noticed. "Victor called me," he said, "about the bank." She turned to look at him. "He got the meeting," Reynolds said. "Next Thursday. He thinks—" He stopped, started again more carefully. "He doesn't make promises. You should know that about Victor. He doesn't tell you something good is coming until it's done. But I know Victor Reyes, and when he calls me to report progress, the word he uses is confident." Emily absorbed that. "I don't know how to thank you for any of this," she said. "You don't thank me," Reynolds said. "That's not how this works." "Then how does it work?" He thought about it. "You were already doing the right thing before we got here. The cafe was already open. Lily was already sleeping in the back. You were already fighting to keep the place that mattered to you." He looked at her steadily. "All we did was stand beside someone who was already standing." Emily looked out at the parking lot. "Jack," she said, "that night when you were in the booth and you asked me why I opened the door, I remember. I said because someone needed help. You did. I didn't think past that. I didn't calculate anything. I didn't think about what it might lead to. Someone was on the ground in the snow, and that was the only piece of information that mattered to me in that moment." Reynolds was quiet for a moment. "That's not as common as you'd think," he said. "People talk about helping. They talk about it a lot. They post about it. They write about it. But when someone is actually on the ground, in the snow, in the cold, in the dark, and helping them is going to cost them something." He paused. "Most people close the door a little tighter. I couldn't do that." "I know." He looked at her. "That's why we're here." Below the porch, one of the crew members was carrying a new window frame toward the east wall, the one that had needed replacing for 2 years that Emily had covered with plastic sheeting during the worst of the cold. She watched the man carry it with the ease of someone who'd carried 1,000 of them, and she watched 2 others meet him and take it from him without being asked. And the 3 of them worked the frame into position with the conversation of people who'd done this many times before and trusted each other completely. She thought about what Michael had said. Every single person in that chapter chose to be there, and everybody else in it chose to let them in. She was starting to understand what he meant. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize with a Colorado Springs area code. "Ms. Carter, my name is Angela Torres. My husband is the chapter president in New Mexico. You may have heard his name. I'm a journalist. I have heard what's happening in Cedar Hollow, and I would like to tell your story if you're willing. No chapter coverage. Your story. The cafe your father, the door you opened. I think people need to hear it. Please call me when you have a moment." Emily read the text twice. She thought about the regional paper reporter who'd called wanting to ask about harboring criminals. She thought about the difference between someone who came to a story wanting to confirm what they already believed and someone who came to it wanting to find out what was actually true. She typed back, "I'll call you tomorrow." She put the phone in her pocket. The light was fading and the temperature was dropping, and the crews were wrapping up for the day with the organized efficiency that had defined everything about this operation And in the parking lot, men and women who had driven or ridden from multiple states were making plans for dinner and checking into the Route 9 motel and talking to each other with the ease of people who shared a language even when they'd never met. Sandra Hewitt was still there. She was talking to a woman from the Phoenix chapter, someone who had arrived that morning, and Sandra was laughing at something the woman had said. Emily stood and watched her neighbor, the woman who had told her to turn off the lights, standing in the middle of what that open door had become, laughing with a stranger whose path she would have crossed the street to avoid 2 weeks ago. Dale Pritchard had already left, but he'd put a note on Emily's counter, a receipt from the hardware store marked paid for a supply order that had apparently been more than $200 worth of materials. Diane Walsh was making one final walk through the building, noting what had been accomplished today and what was staged for tomorrow, and she moved through the space with the satisfaction of someone watching a plan execute correctly, which Emily was learning was as close to joy as Diane Walsh visibly expressed. Michael found Emily at the porch railing as the day finished. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I genuinely don't know," she said. "I'm past the point where I have a word for it." "That's probably the right place to be." "Is it?" "Yeah." He leaned on the railing beside her. "Because if you could name it, it would mean it fit inside something you already knew. And this?" He gestured at the parking lot, at the trucks, at the evidence of a day's work by 100 people who had come for a woman they'd never met. "This doesn't fit inside anything most people already know." Emily thought about that. "Michael," she said, "that night, when you said I filled in something, you were talking about the chapter, about belonging somewhere." "Yeah, I think—" She stopped, started again. "I think I've been so focused on keeping what my father left that I forgot what he was actually trying to leave me. It wasn't the building." She looked out at the road. "It was this. The thing that happens when you keep the lights on and the door open. He knew this would happen. Not specifically, but the accumulation of it. He knew." Michael was quiet for a moment. "That note he left in the deed," he said. "Jack told me about it. This place fed a lot of hungry people. Don't let it stop." "He told you about that?" "He told a few of us." Michael looked at her. "That note was the part of the story that made people get on their bikes and ride." Emily gripped the railing. The last of the light was leaving the sky above the mountains, the kind of winter dusk that went from gold to purple in about 20 minutes, and the parking lot was quieting down, and the road was empty the way it got in the early evening before the night trucks started running, and somewhere in the building her daughter was probably setting the table the way Emily had asked her to, and possibly talking to the Penguin book at the same time. She thought about 41 days. She thought about Victor Reyes and the word confident. She thought about the man in the snow and the locked door, and the 5 seconds that had not felt like 5 seconds at all. She thought about her father standing behind this counter in 1987 with the look on his face like he couldn't believe he'd actually done it. She thought he'd be able to believe this. She hoped he was watching. "Go eat something," she told Michael. "Sandra's people left enough food to feed twice as many of you." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the ma'am was not ironic. It was the genuine article, and he went inside. Emily stayed on the porch until the last of the daylight was gone. Then she turned around and went back into her father's cafe, which was already looking like something more than it had been before, which was not finished yet, which was warm and lit and full of the sound of people, which was exactly what it was always supposed to be. She picked up the phone and called Angela Torres back. "Tell me what your story looks like," she said, "and then I'll tell you if it's true." Angela Torres called back at 8 in the morning, which told Emily something about her before she'd said 10 words. People who called at 8 in the morning, they were not people who wasted time warming up to things. They were people who had already been thinking, who had already organized what they wanted to say, who arrived at the conversation ready. Emily respected that even before she knew whether she trusted her. "I want to be straight with you from the start," Angela said. "I don't do feature pieces that make people look good for the sake of making them look good. I write what's actually there. If your story is what Jack Reynolds described, it'll carry itself. If there are parts of it that are complicated, I'll write those too, because complicated true things are more useful to people than simple false ones." Emily considered that for a moment. "What parts do you think might be complicated?" "The husband who disappeared," Angela said. "The debt he left. The bank that's been pressing you. The fact that you opened your door partly because you're a decent person and partly because you were already in a situation where you had almost nothing left to lose, and decent people make different calculations when they're at the edge. The cafe was empty. Early morning pre-crew pre-customers, the specific quiet of a place that was about to become active and hadn't yet. Emily was at the counter with her coffee. That last part, she said, you think that's why I opened the door because I had nothing to lose? I think it's one of the reasons, Angela said. I think most honest stories have more than one reason underneath them. People who tell you they did something for purely one reason are usually simplifying. Emily thought about the 5 seconds at the locked door. She thought about the man in the snow, the blue at the edges of Michael's lips, the calculation her body had run before her mind caught up with it. She thought about the $7 in the register and the letter under the coffee maker, and whether any of that had lived in the same moment as her hand on the deadbolt. She didn't know. She genuinely didn't know, and that uncertainty felt more honest than any version she could have packaged neatly. Come up Thursday, she said. The bank meeting is Thursday morning. Come after that. A brief pause. You want to know how the bank meeting goes before you decide? I want to know how the bank meeting goes before I know what the whole story is, Emily said. Because if Victor walks out of there empty-handed, the story ends differently, and I don't want to tell it to you before I know how it ends. Angela Torres was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Thursday afternoon, I'll be there at 2. She hung up. The bank meeting was at 9 Thursday morning in Glenwood Springs, 40 minutes down the mountain in Diane's truck, because Diane had insisted on driving, and Emily had learned quickly enough not to argue with Diane about logistics. Victor Reyes had driven up from Santa Fe the night before and was waiting in the bank parking lot when they arrived, in a pressed jacket and good boots, and with the specific contained energy of a man who had done this many times and understood that visible calm was itself a form of preparation. He shook Emily's hand and looked at her steadily. How are you feeling? He asked. Honest answer. Always. Like I'm walking into something that's already been decided and I'm just there to find out which way. Victor nodded. That's accurate. Banks make their internal decisions before you sit down. The meeting is where we find out what they decided and whether we can shift it. He straightened his jacket. The leverage I mentioned, the federal compliance issue, I've confirmed it's substantive. They know I've confirmed it. That's what got us into the room. What does that mean for the outcome? It means they came in today motivated to find a solution that doesn't require litigation. He looked at her. That's not a guarantee. That's a posture. Our job is to work with the posture. Emily took a breath. Okay. One more thing, Victor said. In the room, let me lead. If they say something that's factually wrong, signal me. If they say something that makes you angry, which they will look at your hands for 3 seconds before you respond. 3 seconds is enough to make the difference between a reaction and a response. My father used to say something like that. Smart man. He gestured toward the door. Let's go. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Emily looked at her hands 7 times. The bank officer, a man named Griswold, with the particular energy of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it no longer registered as news to him, personally opened with a restatement of the foreclosure timeline that was word for word identical to the letter delivered with the same smooth finality. Emily felt the stone in her chest shift slightly heavier. Then Victor opened his folder. What followed was not a confrontation. It was more precise than that. Victor laid out 3 specific provisions of federal small business lending regulations that the bank's process had failed to meet, each one documented, each one with the specific date and action that constituted the failure. He did it without drama. He did it the way a carpenter lays out the right tool for each step of a job. This one here, this one there, this one last. Griswold's expression didn't change, but he stopped looking at Emily and started looking at Victor, which was itself a kind of acknowledgement. Victor then presented a restructuring proposal. Extended timeline, modified interest, a deferment on the first 6 months of the new schedule to allow the cafe's revenue, which had, as of this week, increased substantially due to construction improvements and regional press attention, to stabilize. He had documentation for the revenue projection. He had documentation for the construction improvements. He had, Emily realized, been preparing this for days, quietly and without telling her the full scope, because the full scope would have been one more thing to carry. Griswold took the folder. He asked to step out. He was gone for 22 minutes. Emily and Victor sat in the conference room, and Victor drank water, and Emily looked at her hands without counting. This time just looked at them, at the burn mark on her right index finger, from the oven rack, at the calluses from the coffee pot, handles at the knuckles that were always slightly rough from the cold water at the washing station. Her father's hands had looked like this. She thought about him building the cafe in 1987, with those same kind of hands pouring everything he had into something that was supposed to last. She thought about 38 days down from 41, and the way a number could change the texture of everything you thought about. Griswold came back. He sat down. He put the folder on the table between them. "We're prepared to discuss the restructuring proposal," he said. Emily looked at her hands one more time. She did not cry. She had decided that in the car on the way down clearly and without drama, and she honored it. But her hands were shaking slightly when she signed the preliminary agreement 40 minutes later. And Victor noticed, and he said nothing about it, which was exactly the right thing to do. In the truck on the way back up the mountain, Diane drove, and Emily sat in the passenger seat and said nothing for the first 10 miles. Diane didn't push. She drove the way she did everything with complete attention and no wasted movement, and let the silence be what it needed to be. Finally, Emily said, "He agreed to a 12-month deferment." "I heard," Diane said. She'd been in the waiting area for the full 2 hours. "That's enough time to actually rebuild the revenue." "It is. Victor thinks if the article runs and the cafe gets the right kind of attention, we could be operating in the black within 6 months." "Victor's conservative," Diane said. "I think 4. Emily looked at the mountains coming back into view as they climbed. "Diane, when this is over, when the repairs are done and the bank is sorted and everything settles, I want to pay you back. Properly. I know that's not how Jack framed it, but it's how I need to approach it." Diane was quiet for a moment. "What does properly mean to you?" "Oh, I don't know yet, but something real. Not a thank you card." "Fair enough," Diane said. "We'll figure it out when we get there." She glanced over. "You know what your cafe is going to be worth in a year, after the repairs, with the story out, with the traffic that's going to come through that highway specifically, because people heard about the place." Emily hadn't let herself think about that. It had felt too much like counting eggs. "A lot more than it was 2 weeks ago," Diane said. "That's the real payment. Not to me personally, I don't need it, but to your father's investment, to what he built. That's what's getting paid back." Emily looked at the road. "He would have liked you," she said. "He sounds like someone I'd have gotten along with," Diane agreed. They got back to Cedar Hollow at noon, and the crew was already deep into the day's work, and the parking lot had the organized energy of a project in its final phase. Not the explosive activity of the first days, but the focused, quieter work of people who could see the finish line and were moving toward it deliberately. Angela Torres arrived at 2 o'clock exactly. She was younger than Emily had imagined from her voice, early 30s. Sharp-eyed with a notebook that was already half full of handwriting Emily couldn't read from a distance. She came in and sat at the counter and looked around the cafe with the specific attention of a person who was being paid to notice things, and she ordered coffee and didn't take notes while she drank it. "Tell me about your father," she said. Emily had expected her to start with the storm, with the door, with the night that had become the center of everything. The question about Robert Carter surprised her enough that she answered it without filtering. She told Angela about the cafe in 1987, about the photographs on the far wall, the black and whites of the highway in different decades, about learning to make pie at 11 years old, standing on a step stool at the prep table because the counter was too high, about Robert Carter's conviction, which was so complete it had never been stated as a belief but simply lived as a practice, that the road out front was there for people, and people on the road deserved the chance to stop. She told Angela about the note in the deed. "This place fed a lot of hungry people. Don't let it stop." Angela wrote that down. Then she asked about the husband, and Emily had known it was coming, and she answered it anyway because Angela had promised complicated, true things, and Emily had agreed to that, and the agreement mattered. His name was Daniel Carter. She'd married him at 26, which felt from the distance of 6 years like a decision made by someone who was still figuring out what she was actually looking for. Daniel was charming in the specific way of people who have studied what charm looks like and replicated it accurately enough that you don't notice the study. He was gone before Lily turned 2. He was not dead, not disappeared in any dramatic sense. He had simply left, leaving behind a marriage certificate, A 7-month-old, 3 credit cards at their limits, and a cafe loan he'd co-signed and then stopped making payments on. Do you know where he is? Angela asked. Somewhere in Nevada, last I heard, Emily said. I stopped trying to know about 2 years ago. It was using energy I needed for other things. Like the cafe. Like Lily, Emily said. The cafe comes after Lily. It's always come after Lily. Angela looked at her. That's the part of this story that people are going to need to understand, she said. Not the bikers, not the door, the part where you had every reason to be bitter and closed, and you weren't. That's not as common as it sounds. Emily thought about Sandra Hewitt telling her to turn off the lights. She thought about the fact that Sandra had also been the first person to bring food for the crew and the last to leave that first big day. People are more than their fear, Emily said. I believed that before the storm. I just had a lot of evidence for it after. Angela wrote that down too. She spent 3 hours at the cafe talking to Emily and then to Diane and then briefly to Michael, who was still in town, helping with the finishing work and who spoke about the night of the storm with the directness of someone who understood he'd been close to something permanent and had decided not to shy away from saying so. She talked to Sandra Hewitt, who arrived apparently by instinct at the exact moment she was needed, and who told the story of calling Emily that night with the complete willingness of someone who had already made peace with not being the hero of it. I told her to lock the door, Sandra said. Straight out. I was scared, and I told her what scared people say. She paused. She didn't listen, and I have been grateful every single day since then that she didn't listen to me. Angela wrote that down. She left at 5 with her notebook and a promise to have a draft by the following Tuesday. She sent it Monday. Emily read it at the counter after closing the cafe quiet, Lily asleep in the back. The new heating element in the coffee maker running smooth and silent. She read it twice. The second time she had to stop twice, not because it was wrong, but because seeing your own life rendered accurately and with care was a particular kind of hard that she hadn't anticipated. Angela had gotten it right. The father, the door, the debt and the storm, and the man in the snow. She'd gotten the bikers right, not soft, not sanitized, not converted into something comfortable for people who needed them to be comfortable. She'd written them as they were a community with its own code and its own history and its own complicated relationship with the world that had spent decades fearing them. And she'd let that complexity stand without resolving it into a cleaner story than the real one. She'd written Lily as a 7-year-old who went back to sleep because her mother's voice wasn't afraid, which was the most precise thing anyone had ever said about her daughter. And Emily had to set the draft down for a minute when she got to that part. She called Angela at 8. It's true, she said. Good. Angela sounded like she'd been waiting for the call. I'm running it Sunday. Where? Regional paper, obviously. But I have a contact at the Associated Press who read it this afternoon. He wants to pick it up. Emily was quiet. What does that mean? She asked, though some part of her already understood. It means by Sunday evening, your story is in a lot of living rooms, Angela said. Not just Colorado, national wire. Emily's hand tightened on the phone. I'm not a national story, she said. You are now, Angela said. You have been since the moment Jack Reynolds made his first call. I'm just the part that puts words to what was already moving. Emily thought about what Reynolds had said on the porch. Word about what you did traveled faster than I expected. She thought about Torres making calls, and Torres's people making calls, and 117 motorcycles in her parking lot on a Friday morning. She thought about the sign that was going up above the door next week, the one Sal had offered to make carved from a piece of mountain pine that one of the chapter members had brought specifically for the purpose. She thought about what the sign was going to say. She hadn't told anyone but Lily what the words were. She'd thought of them the morning after the storm, standing at the counter with her first cup of coffee, looking at the door she'd opened and thinking about what her father would have wanted written above it. Angela, she said, the article. At the end. Can you put something in? What is it? Emily looked at the door. Something my father knew, she said, that I didn't fully understand until now. She told Angela the words. Angela was quiet for a moment, then, yeah, that's the end of the piece. She hung up. Saturday passed in the specific suspended animation way of days before something happens. The crew was finishing the final interior work, paint trim, the replaced window on the east wall, the upgraded lighting that made the dining room feel warmer and cleaner without losing the particular quality of a place that had been lived in rather than designed. Diane was doing her final walkthrough item by item, the same thoroughness that she'd brought to every stage. And the men around her moved to her assessments the way experienced crews do, trusting the eye of the person whose judgment had proven sound. Reynolds arrived midday. He hadn't been back since the first big workday. He'd been coordinating from a distance, Emily knew, managing the logistics of what had become a multi-chapter effort, the kind of administrative and organizational labor that never showed up in the story, but made the story possible. He came in and had coffee and didn't make a speech about anything which she appreciated. He walked through the building, looked at what had been done, and came back to the counter with the expression of a man confirming something he'd expected to be true. "Diane does good work," he said. "Diane does exceptional work," Emily said. "Don't tell her that too directly. She'll increase her day rate." Emily almost laughed. "She's not charging a day rate." "I know," he said. "I was joking." He drank his coffee. "How's the bank situation?" 12-month deferment. Victor's language in the agreement is he used the word ironclad. Reynolds nodded slowly. "Good. And the article runs tomorrow." He looked up. "A P pickup." Angela says yes. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression that he didn't put a name to and she didn't ask him to. "Your father built something that deserved to last," he said finally. "He did. And you kept it." "We kept it," Emily said, because by this point that word we had expanded to include people she hadn't known a month ago, and it was the accurate word, and she used it deliberately. Reynolds drank his coffee, put the cup down. "There's something I should tell you," he said. His voice had changed. Not dramatically, Reynolds didn't do dramatic changes, but there was a different quality to it, something that made Emily set down what she was holding. "Okay," she said. "The night of the storm. Michael didn't just have hypothermia." She waited. He'd been having a hard few months before that ride. Personal things. The kind of things that make a 23-year-old make bad decisions about how long to stay outside in a blizzard on a mountain pass. He held her gaze. He wasn't careless about the cold Emily. He was indifferent to it. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Emily understood what he was saying. She understood it completely and immediately, and she stood very still while the understanding moved through her. "He didn't tell me that," she said. "No, he wouldn't have." Reynolds' voice was careful and steady. "He's doing better now, significantly better, partly because of what happened that night, because someone made the choice to pull him back from something, even not knowing they were doing it." He paused. "I'm not telling you this to change the story or to make it heavier than it already is. I'm telling you because you said you opened the door because someone needed help. And I want you to know how true that was. How much more true than you knew." Emily pressed her hands flat on the counter. She thought about Michael standing at her counter at midnight saying, "I've been writing for 6 years, never had anything like that happen." She thought about the careful way he'd been moving when he came back with the box from Reynolds. She thought about him saying it filled in something, in the particular way he'd said it, like a man describing a gap in himself that had recently been addressed. She thought about a 23-year-old in the snow on a mountain pass, indifferent to the cold. "Does he know you're telling me?" she asked. "He asked me to," Reynolds said. "He said you should know what you actually did." Emily looked at the door she'd opened. She thought about the letter above it, the words that were going to be carved into the mountain pine next week, the words that were going to be the end of Angela's article. She thought about her father and the note in the deed, and everything she'd understood about it until this moment and everything she understood about it now. "Jack," she said, "the night you left, you said people who open doors when everyone tells them to close them are never forgotten." She looked at him. "I thought you meant in a general way, in a philosophical way." "I meant it the way I said it. But you didn't know what Michael—" "I knew enough," he said quietly. "I've been leading people for 20 years. You learn to see what's underneath, what a person's carrying that they're not saying." He looked at his hands. "I knew the night of the storm was not an ordinary night for Michael. I knew Cedar Hollow was not an ordinary stop. And I knew that the woman who opened that door without knowing any of it had done something that mattered in a way she wasn't going to be able to measure for a while." Emily was quiet for a long time. Outside, Sal was measuring the space above the door for the sign. She could hear the quiet business of it, the tape measure, the pencil against wood, the unhurried competence of someone who took craftsmanship seriously. "That's why you called Diane before you were off the road," she said. "Yes." "And Victor?" "Yes." "You weren't just paying back a kindness," she said. "You were—" Making sure someone who'd done something important didn't lose everything before they understood what they'd done, he said simply. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the coffee pot and refilled his cup because it was the thing she knew how to do, and some truths were better honored with action than with words. Stay for dinner, she said. Lily's been asking about you. She wants to tell you something about emperor penguins. Reynolds looked at her. Something shifted in his face, something genuine and unguarded, the kind of expression that showed up in people who had spent a long time being seen a certain way by the world and were occasionally surprised by a different kind of seeing. Yeah, he said, I'd like that. She went to the kitchen to start the dinner, and behind her the cafe was warm and almost finished, and outside Sal was fitting the sign above the door, and somewhere a journalist was putting the final period on a story that would run tomorrow morning on a national wire and reach people in places Emily Carter had never been and would never go. And in the back room, Lily was awake now. She could hear her talking to the Penguin book in the one-sided but deeply serious way she had, the same way Emily's father used to talk to his plants in the greenhouse he'd kept behind the cafe until the frost took them. Like everything around her was alive and worth talking to. Like the world was worth addressing directly. Emily put the pan on the burner. She thought about the morning the article would run. She thought about people reading it over coffee at kitchen tables, on phones in waiting rooms. She thought about what it might mean to someone who was standing at their own locked door somewhere with their hand on their own deadbolt, with someone outside in their own kind of snow. She hoped they would open it. She turned up the heat. She started to cook. The article ran Sunday morning at 6:14 a.m., which was when the Associated Press pushed it to the wire, and Emily knew the exact time because Angela texted her the moment it went live. And Emily was already awake, had been awake since 5, sitting at the counter in the dark with her coffee, and the specific quiet of a cafe before it opens, the kind of quiet that felt like the building itself was still sleeping. She read the article on her phone. She'd read the draft twice already, but reading the published version was different. It had a different weight to it. The words were the same words, but they existed now in a different way. They were out in the world, unretrievable, making their way into the morning routines of people she would never meet, sitting beside their coffee the way hers was sitting beside hers. Angela had titled it, "The Door Nobody Would Open." The last line of the piece was the thing Emily had told her on the phone that night, the words her father had known and that she hadn't fully understood until Reynolds told her about Michael, until she understood that opening a door for someone in the snow sometimes meant something more than getting them out of the cold. The last line read, "Sometimes the person everyone tells you to fear is the person standing between someone you love and the dark." Emily set her phone down on the counter. She sat with that for a while. By 7:30, her phone had rung 11 times. She recognized 3 of the numbers. The other 8 she did not, and she let them go to voicemail and checked the messages while the coffee maker ran the first full pot of the morning. A woman in Ohio who said she'd read the article and cried and wanted Emily to know that her own father had owned a diner and she understood exactly what was at stake. A man in Georgia who said his son rode with a chapter and people didn't understand. They just didn't understand, and thank God someone finally showed it. A retired teacher in Washington State who said she used to drive Route 9 every summer for 15 years on her way to visit her sister, and she was going to drive it again this summer, and she was going to stop. Emily listened to each message standing at the pass-through window. Then she called Lily. "Breakfast," she said through the apartment door. "We've got a big day." Lily appeared 4 minutes later in her school clothes, even though it was Sunday, because Lily had a strong opinion about what constituted a big day, and it apparently involved dressing for it. She had the Penguin book under her arm. "Is it because of the article?" she asked. "Partly," Emily said. "And partly just because—" Lily climbed onto her stool. "Michael texted me good morning," she said. Emily looked at her. "Michael has your number." "I asked him for his number in case I had more questions about motorcycles," Lily said with complete reasonableness. "He gave me his and took mine. Is that bad?" "That's fine," Emily said, because it was, and because the particular way Lily said motorcycles with the seriousness of a researcher pursuing a subject was one of those things Emily was going to remember for the rest of her life. "What have you been asking him? About the engines mostly, and where he rides, and whether he's ever been to the ocean." She spread her butter. "He's been to both oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific." "That's a lot of riding." "He said the Pacific is better, but only in the morning. I told him I'd like to see that someday." She took a bite of toast. He said he'd make sure I got two. Emily turned back to the stove so her daughter wouldn't see her face. The first customer arrived at 8:45. Harold Fitch, 71 years old, retired postal worker, had been coming to the Hollow Cup for 17 years and had strong opinions about the correct coffee-to-creamer ratio. He sat at his usual stool, looked around at the repairs with the evaluating squint of a man who'd done enough home improvement to recognize good work and said, "Roof looks solid." "New section on the east slope," Emily said. "Foundation addressed." He nodded. "Your father would have done this himself if he were 60 years younger." "He'd have done it himself if he were 60 years older," Emily said. "He was stubborn that way." Harold made a sound of agreement, which was more exhale than word. "I saw the article this morning," he said. "My daughter sent it to me. She lives in Denver. What did you think?" "I thought it sounded like you." He looked at her directly. "And I thought it sounded like Robert." He picked up his coffee. "That reporter got it right. That's not always how it goes." By 10 o'clock, the cafe was full. Not its regular kind of full where every seat was occupied, and there was a 10-minute wait on the weekend breakfast rush. This was a different full, the kind that came in waves, people arriving in clusters. Some of them with phones showing the article, some of them who had driven specifically, some of them who had just happened to be on Route 9 and remembered the name from somewhere and pulled over. Emily had called in her weekend help at 9 as soon as she saw the shape of what was happening. Danny, who worked Saturdays normally and was 19 and fast arrived at 9:15, and took one look at the dining room and went straight to the kitchen without being told to. Sandra Hewitt walked in at 9:30 with her sister and sat at the window booth and ordered the full breakfast and didn't say anything particular about the article or the crowd or any of it, just sat there eating her eggs with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who was present for something she was glad to be present for. Dale Pritchard came in at 10. He stood at the door for a moment, surveying the room the way he surveyed everything, cataloging, assessing. Then he found a spot at the counter and waited patiently for Emily to get to him, which she did eventually. "National wire," he said. "So I hear." "You're going to need more staff," he said. "This isn't a week thing. People are going to keep coming." "I know." "My granddaughter is looking for work," he said. "She's reliable. She doesn't complain. She's been watching you run this place since she was about Lily's age, and she knows how you like things done." Emily looked at him. "Send her Tuesday morning." Dale nodded satisfied and ordered the biscuits. The phone calls kept coming through the morning. Emily stopped counting at 30. Angela called at 11 to report that the article had been picked up by 6 more outlets, 2 of them television, and that a producer from a morning show in Denver had reached out about a potential segment. Emily said she'd think about it, which Angela translated correctly as "ask me again in a week when I've processed more of this." Reynolds called at noon. "I've been watching my phone all morning," he said. "I've heard from 8 different chapters who saw the story. Good things are complicated things. Good things, chapter members who've been in situations similar to Michael's, who wanted me to pass along." He paused. "They wanted to say thank you, specifically, not to the article, to you, for the part about what you actually did that night, even not knowing." Emily stood at the back of the kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and the noise of the full dining room coming through the pass-through and her eyes on the middle distance of nothing in particular. "How is he?" she asked. She always meant Michael when she said he now, and Reynolds always understood. "Good," Reynolds said to Ren. "Really good. He's been doing the work. The kind of work you have to do internally, not just externally." A pause. "He asked me if he could come up next weekend, help with anything that's left. I told him that was your call." "Tell him yes," Emily said. "Tell him to bring his appetite." Reynolds made his sound that was not quite a laugh. "I'll tell him. Jack." She hesitated for a second. "The twist of all of this, the thing I keep coming back to. I opened that door not knowing anything. I didn't know about Michael. I didn't know about you or Diane or Victor or Angela or any of it. I just opened the door because someone was on the ground." "Yeah," Reynolds said, "and you're telling me that's enough? That just doing the right thing without knowing the full picture, without knowing what's on the other side of it, is enough?" "I'm telling you it's everything," he said. "The full picture comes later. It always comes later. You can't see it when you're standing at the door." She thought about that. "I couldn't have calculated any of this," she said. "If I tried to calculate it, I would have made the wrong choice. Most people who make the right choice don't calculate it. Reynolds said. That's what makes it the right choice. She heard Lily's voice from the dining room high and clear, saying something to a customer that made the customer laugh, and she thought about a 7-year-old who went back to sleep in a storm because her mother's voice wasn't afraid. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. I know you don't want me to. I'm doing it anyway. A pause, then quietly, you're welcome, Emily. He hung up. The afternoon brought more people, and with them came the moment Emily had not fully prepared for, the one that hit her in the middle of the lunch rush with the force of something she should have seen coming. A man walked in alone at 1:15, 50-something, thin in the way of people who'd been through something physical recently. He had a motorcycle jacket but no patch, and he walked with a slight hesitation on the left side that spoke of an old injury or a new one that wasn't quite healed. He found the last open spot at the counter and sat down and looked at the menu with the careful attention of someone who didn't want to look up yet. Emily got to him eventually. Coffee, she said. Please. He kept his eyes on the menu. I read the article this morning. A lot of people did, she said. I drove up from Pueblo. He looked up for the first time. His eyes were tired in a specific way she was starting to recognize. I don't know anyone here. I needed to come somewhere that the door was open. He stopped. It doesn't sound like anything except what it is, Emily said. She poured his coffee. She didn't ask him anything else because he did not need questions. He needed coffee and a seat in the particular atmosphere of a place where the door was open and the lights were on and somebody was making food in the kitchen without asking whether you deserved to eat. He sat there for 2 hours. He ordered the soup and the biscuits and a piece of pie, the cherry, which was what Emily's father had always said was the truest test of a cafe. He tipped 40%, which Emily only saw after he'd gone. He left a note on a paper napkin that she found when she cleared the counter. It said, "Thank you for keeping the lights on." She folded it and put it in the same inside pocket where she kept Reynolds' letter. By 4 o'clock, she had 2 napkin notes and 1 handwritten card. By closing, she had 7. She read them all that night after Lily was in bed, sitting at the counter in the dark with the lights of the cafe turned low, the way her father used to sit when he was doing his end-of-day accounting, which he'd always done by hand, even after computers made it unnecessary, because he said the handwriting made him feel each number, and you couldn't afford to not feel your numbers. 7 notes from 7 strangers. A truck driver who'd been thinking about quitting, a woman whose mother had died and who had been in the car for 3 hours just driving and had pulled off at the Hollow Cup because the lights were on. A young man who didn't explain himself at all, just wrote, "I needed this today," and signed his first name. An elderly couple from Wyoming who had been married 54 years and wanted Emily to know her father sounded like the kind of man who made the world make sense. She read each one twice. She thought about the morning after the storm, about standing at the counter, feeling the strange hollow lightness of having given everything she had, not knowing yet what any of it meant. She knew now, not completely. You didn't complete an understanding like this. In 3 weeks, it was the kind of understanding that grew in you over years. But she knew the shape of it, the basic architecture. The door was not just the door of the Hollow Cup. It was a thing people felt across distances they had no way of measuring from the other side. Monday morning, Sal finished the sign. He knocked on the cafe door at 7:30 before opening, and Emily let him in, and they stood together looking at the piece of mountain pine he'd brought in from his truck, the one a chapter member had sourced specifically for this purpose from a stand of timber above the tree line. The carving was clean and deep, the letters spaced with the care of someone who understood that words needed room to breathe. Everyone deserves a door that opens. Emily stood in front of it for a long time. Your father's words, Sal asked. Mine, she said, but he's the one who taught me. Sal nodded. He went and got his ladder without being asked. She watched him put it up above the door, and she thought about the night of the storm, and the 5 seconds in the deadbolt, and she thought about Michael in the snow, and she thought about Reynolds' voice saying people who open doors when everyone else tells them to close them are never forgotten. And she thought about a man from Pueblo driving an hour on a Sunday because he needed somewhere the door was open. She understood now that her father had not left her a cafe. He'd left her a door. The cafe was just the building around it. Tuesday arrived with the kind of clarity that follows a lot of rain. Everything sharp and specific, the air holding itself accountable. Dale's granddaughter, whose name was Cassie, and who was 22, and moved through the dining room with the instinctive spatial awareness of someone who had indeed been watching how this place worked, Since she was small, came in at 8, and learned the system in 40 minutes and made exactly 0 unnecessary mistakes, which was the closest thing to a perfect first day Emily had ever seen. At 10:15, a van pulled into the parking lot, white unmarked out-of-state plates. Emily watched it through the window while she refilled coffee the way she watched everything now, not with fear but with the open attention of someone who had learned that unexpected arrivals were not a category to respond to before you knew what they were. 4 women got out. They were between 60 and 75, all 4 of them, and they came through the door with the deliberate, organized energy of people who had a plan and were executing it. The one in front, silver-haired and moving with the ease of a woman who had been somewhere in charge of something for most of her adult life, looked around the cafe and then looked at Emily with the directness of recognition. "You're Emily Carter," she said. "I am. We drove from Kansas City." She said it the way you say a thing that explains itself. "We read the article Sunday. We talked about it Sunday afternoon. We got in the van Sunday evening." She looked around again. "My name is Harriet. These are my friends. We have been having breakfast together every Sunday for 31 years in a diner that closed last month. And we needed somewhere new." She paused. "We'd like a table." Emily looked at her. "The round one's at the back," she said. "Best table in the house. My father always kept it for groups." Harriet's expression did something small and genuine. "Thank you." They took the round table. They ordered 4 breakfasts and 4 coffees, and they talked for 2.5 hours with the ease of women who had been talking to each other for 31 years and still had things to say. Emily kept their coffee filled without being asked the way you did for people who belonged in the room. When they left, Harriet came to the counter. "We're going to come back," she said. "Not just us. There's a group of us in Kansas City people who used to meet at the diner, about 20 of them. We'd like to come up in the spring." She set a card on the counter. "If that's something you'd welcome." Emily picked up the card. A retired school teacher, 37 years in the Kansas City public school system. "I'll hold the round table," Emily said. Harriet squeezed her hand once and went out the door. Cassie appeared at Emily's elbow. "Who were they?" "New regulars," Emily said. Cassie looked at the door. "From Kansas City." "People come from where they come from," Emily said. "Our job is to be here when they arrive." Cassie nodded like this made complete sense, which it did, and went back to her section. The week moved with the new rhythm that the article had established. Traffic on Route 9 that stopped at the Hollow Cup was running 30% higher than the same week last year, which Victor mentioned when he called with the updated revenue projections, and which he said with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose modeling had proven conservative rather than optimistic. The bank had countersigned the restructuring agreement. It was done. It was legally done. Emily had the paperwork in the drawer under the register in a manila folder, next to the note from Harriet in the 7 napkins and Reynolds' letter. Michael arrived Friday evening as promised. He came alone this time, not with the chapter, just himself on his bike pulling into the parking lot at 6 o'clock, with the last of the winter light catching the chrome, and he came through the door and hung his jacket on the hook near the entrance, the same hook Emily noticed that he'd used when the crew was here, like he'd already claimed it, and he sat at the counter and said, "Whatever you don't need done, I'll do the other thing." Emily looked at him. He was different from the first time she'd seen him, which was face up in her booth going gray at the lips. He was different even from the second time when he'd carried the box to her counter with the careful movement of someone still feeling his edges. He was present in a way that had more mass to it now, more ground. "Sal's coming tomorrow morning," she said. "There's still trim work on the east wall." "I can do trim," he said. "Can you actually do trim, or are you being optimistic?" "I worked construction for 2 years before I went full-time with the shop," he said. "I can do trim." "Good." She put coffee in front of him. "Are you staying at the Route 9 motel?" "Yeah, same room I had when the crew was here, weirdly. I think the owner is doing it on purpose." "Pete's sentimental," Emily said. "Don't read too much into it, or he'll start offering you a discount." Michael smiled. It was a good smile, full and real, the kind that took up the right amount of space on a person's face. Lily appeared from the apartment at 6:15, as if she had a sensor for Michael's arrival, which Emily suspected she might. "You came," Lily said, climbing onto her stool with the certainty of a child who had been told something would happen and is satisfied that it has. "I said I would," Michael said. "I know." She opened the Penguin book on the counter. "I have a question. About the Pacific Ocean. Okay. You said it's better in the morning. Why, Michael considered this seriously because that was how he answered Lily's questions with the same care he'd given adults' question, which was something Emily had noticed from the first time and appreciated more than she'd said. Because in the morning, the light comes from the east and hits the water from the side instead of from above, he said. And when the light hits water from the side, it goes inside it instead of just bouncing off. So you see the color of it, not just the reflection. Lily absorbed this. That's the same way light works on snow, she said. Michael looked at her. Yeah, he said slowly. It is actually. So the Pacific Ocean in the morning is like snow. In a way. Lily nodded, satisfied. She wrote something in the margin of the Penguin book, which was a thing she did when information needed to be recorded for later. Emily watched the two of them from the other side of the counter and thought about Michael on a mountain pass in a blizzard, indifferent to the cold, and a 7-year-old in a red coat who had gone back to sleep because her mother's voice wasn't afraid, and she thought about the particular way the world sometimes arranged its second chances. She thought, he's going to be okay. She thought it with the certainty she trusted, the same certainty that had told her a man's lips were too blue, and she had 20 minutes the same certainty that had put her hand on the deadbolt. She was right about those things. She was right about this. The twist came Saturday morning, and it came in the form of a phone call at 7 a.m. from a number Emily didn't recognize, which she was getting used to, and a voice she also didn't recognize, which was female and professional and slightly breathless in the way of someone who had been reaching the right person after trying several wrong ones. Is this Emily Carter? The Emily Carter from the article. It is. My name is Rebecca Donnelly. I'm a producer with a documentary production company based in Denver. We've been following the story since the AP Wire Sunday. We'd like to talk to you about a feature documentary, Your Story, the Cafe, the Community Response. A pause. Ms. Carter, I want to be direct. We're talking about a full-length feature, national distribution. The response to the article has been extraordinary, and what you have in Cedar Hollow is something people need to see. Emily stood very still. She thought about the article. She thought about Angela getting it right about the complexity being preserved rather than smoothed into something easier to swallow. She thought about the man from Pueblo and the 7 napkin notes, and Harriet from Kansas City. She thought about what it would mean for the Hollow Cup to be that story on a national scale, for people to know that the door was open, for the sign above the entrance to reach beyond Route 9. She thought about her father standing behind this counter in 1987, with the look on his face like he couldn't believe he'd actually done it. I'll need to talk to some people first, she said. Of course. And I have conditions. We'd expect that. The chapter gets to tell their own story in their own words. No narration over them. No editorial framing that turns them into something convenient. They speak for themselves or they're not in it. A pause. That's yes, we can work with that. And Lily is not on camera unless she decides she wants to be. She's 8 in March. She doesn't make that decision. She's not on camera. Understood. And the cafe is real. It doesn't get prettied up for filming. You shoot what's actually here, not a version of it. Ms. Carter. The producer's voice had changed. It had more respect in it now, the kind that comes from encountering someone who knows exactly what they're protecting. Those are exactly the conditions that make the story worth telling. Emily looked around the cafe, at the photographs on the far wall, the new window on the east side, the sign above the door that Sal had put up Monday morning, at the round table in the back where Harriet and her friends had sat for 2.5 hours, at the counter stool with a small wear pattern where Lily climbed up every morning, at the door. Call me Monday, she said. I'll have an answer. She hung up and stood in the quiet of the early morning and breathed. Then she went and knocked on the door to the apartment. Lily, she said, get dressed. Something important happened, and I want to tell you about it over breakfast. She heard movement from inside. Then Lily's voice, clear and immediate, the voice of a child who did not come slowly out of sleep. Is it good important or complicated important? Emily thought about it. Both, she said. The best things usually are. She went to start the coffee. She called Reynolds on Sunday evening. She told him about the documentary. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what did you say? I told her I had conditions. Good conditions. The only kind I make. He made his sound that was not quite a laugh. What do you need from us? I need to know that the chapter is genuinely willing, she said. Not willing because you told them to be, actually willing, because if they're not, it doesn't happen, and I don't care how good the distribution is. I'll ask, he said. But Emily, you need to understand something. After the article, I had people calling me from 6 states, not asking what they should do, telling me what they wanted to do. The chapter has never been more willing to be seen as something accurate than they are right now. He paused. You did that. The article did that. The fact that someone told the true version. Emily looked at the sign above the door from inside the cafe, where you could see it from below the carved letters, dark against the pale pine. Everyone deserves a door that opens. Okay, she said, then we do it. Spring came to Cedar Hollow the way it always did, reluctantly, and then all at once. The snow gave up its grip on the parking lot in late March, and the mountains went from white to brown to the tentative, specific green of high altitude. In April, and Route 9 opened up to the full flow of its traffic, and the Hollow Cup was ready for it in ways it had never been ready before. The documentary crew arrived in April with 4 people and equipment that made the cafe look like a different category of enterprise than Emily was accustomed to, but they worked the way Angela had written, finding what was true and not constructing something more useful. They followed Emily for a week, which was an experience she could only describe as being studied by people who genuinely wanted to understand what they were looking at. They filmed Lily on a Tuesday by Lily's own decision, rendered approximately 5 minutes after Emily explained that it was her choice and that no was a complete answer. Lily thought about it for exactly as long as she needed to, which was not long. I want people to know about my mom, Lily said, and about the door, and about Michael. Can I talk about the penguins? I think they'd like the penguins, Emily said. On camera, Lily talked about the night of the storm, which she described with the accuracy of a 7-year-old who had been half asleep and fully attentive at the same time. She talked about going to the door crack and watching and deciding that her mother wasn't scared and going back to bed. She talked about Michael and the Pacific Ocean in the morning. And then when the interviewer asked her what she thought the most important thing about the whole story was, she took the question with the seriousness it deserved and thought about it for almost 20 seconds. Then she said, "My mom knew someone needed help. That's all she knew. And she opened the door anyway." The interviewer was quiet. "When you know someone needs help," Lily said, "you don't need to know anything else." Lily Carter, 8 years old, 2nd grade, missing one front tooth, the right one which was taking its time, said the truest thing anyone said in the entire documentary. Emily, watching from the other side of the room, did not cry. She had decided that clearly and without drama. She honored it for almost 30 seconds. Reynolds came back to Cedar Hollow in May with 12 writers from the chapter, and they took the same booth that they'd taken the night of the storm and ordered the same coffee, and the place was warm and full of the sound of people. And Emily moved through it with the ease of someone who had done this specific thing enough times to stop counting the repetitions and just live inside the fact of it. At the end of the evening, after the writers had gone and the last customer had paid and Cassie had gone home and Lily was asleep, Reynolds stayed. He sat at the counter with his 3rd cup of coffee, and he looked at the space around him, the way he'd looked at it the night of the storm, with the particular attention of a man who was updating his understanding of something he'd already formed an opinion about. "It's different," he said. "It's the same," Emily said, "just more itself." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said, "that's right." She leaned on the counter across from him. "Jack, I've been thinking about what you said, about the door, about how you can't see the full picture when you're standing at it." "What have you been thinking?" "I've been thinking that's not just about me and the storm," she said. "I think everyone is standing at a door most of the time, their own version of it. And most of the time they can't see what's on the other side. And most of the time they're scared. And most of the time someone is telling them to keep it closed." Reynolds looked at her steadily. "And," he said, "and the only thing that matters," Emily said, "is what you do with your hand on the deadbolt." He held her gaze for a long moment. He picked up his coffee cup. He put it down. "Robert Carter raised someone, right?" he said. Emily stood up straight. "He did," she said, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure that was worth it." She meant the cafe. She meant the door. She meant Lily in the Penguin book, in the 7 napkin notes, and Harriet from Kansas City, and the man from Pueblo, Homictum, who needed somewhere the lights were on. She meant Michael talking about the Pacific in the morning, and Victor and Diane and Angela and Sal with the Mountain Pine and Dale Pritchard sourcing materials, and Sandra Hewitt, who told her to turn off the lights and then brought the casserole and stayed until the end. She meant all of it. Every single piece of what had come through that open door. Reynolds stood, put on his jacket, picked up his helmet from the stool beside him. "The sign," he said, nodding toward the door. "Your father's words or yours?" "Mine," she said, "but only because he taught me the language." Reynolds looked at the sign one more time. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back just once, the way a person turns back when they want to carry an image forward with them. Then he stepped out into the Colorado night, and the door swung shut behind him, and the cafe was quiet, and the lights were on, and above the entrance to a building that a man named Robert Carter had built in 1987, with everything he had, 7 words carved into Mountain Pine, said the thing that had always been true about this place and about the woman who ran it. Emily Carter had opened a door in a blizzard because someone needed help. That was the whole reason. And that was enough. That had always been enough. And it always would be.